Allora aspettiamo che si senta. Si sente? Devo parlarci dentro, va bene. Buongiorno a tutti, grazie per essere tutti qui numerosi. Oggi ci sono tantissimi eventi in contemporanea al Festival dell'Economia. Io direi che non è un caso che noi qui oggi parliamo di città intelligenti quando ci sono le elezioni amministrative in tutta Italia, proprio nelle città, e quindi si voterà e quindi la politica è al centro del dibattito, e siamo qui con uno studioso dell'impatto di Internet sulla politica, quindi mi sembra quanto mai opportuno.
A professor who's an expert on the impact on the internet. And now before I introduce Evgeny MOROZOV, I'd like to say how this 1.5 hours is going to work. We're going to be on time because he has to leave at 1:30, so I would like to have a Q&A after his presentation, so we're going to have some 40 minutes for your Q&A, so be ready to ask questions. We'll try again to do our best and confine with the time limits. I work at La Stampa. My name is Anna Masera. La Stampa is an important Italian newspaper. The reason why I've been asked to moderate this presentation, actually there are a number of reasons why I've been asked. One is that the translator of his latest book, Mr. Fusi, couldn't be with him. And the second reason why I have been chosen is that I've written a book together with La Scorza for the La Terza publishing, and I'd like to thank the publisher, Mr. La Terza, who's sitting here in the first row, for giving us the possibility to write a guide on rights of the internet that we've drafted at the lower chamber in the Italian Parliament, that has also been presented at the Internet Governance Forum in Brazil. I'm quoting this publication because I believe it is relevant. I believe that rights on the internet are an important subject matter, and they are very close to the heart of Evgeny Morozov. Evgeny Morozov doesn't like he's being defined as skeptic versus the internet, but he has fought a battle against the techno-optimists. Indeed, if you can see the world as divided into techno-skepticists and techno-optimists, the techno-optimists believe that it is a good tool to democratize, whereas he believes that we have to forgo our rights, the art about the privacy. Member of Parliament, Rodotà, whom I'd like to thank. He's also much published by La Terza. He's the strongest champion worldwide on the fight for the safeguarding of privacy rights. He has studied personal rights in the digital era, and I'm very sorry he couldn't be with us, because I believe they could have a very interesting discussion with our guest. I'd like to introduce Professor Morozov. As you know, he's a very young scholar. He's 32. He comes from Belarus. He has studied and taught in the US. He speaks some Italian as well. And as a matter of fact, we're going to give him the floor in English. And without further ado, I'd like to give him the floor. And we hope that he shall take some of our questions later on. Thank you very much. Over to you, Evgeny.
Purtroppo devo fare le mie presentazioni in inglese. Ho imparato italiano abbastanza.
Good morning. I've learnt some Italian over the past 2 years, but unfortunately I cannot speak as fast as I can in English.
Let me walk you through my presentation, which will be somewhat linear, but I hope it will all make sense in the end. So I will start very briefly by giving you a history of the smart city as a term, because I think it's very important for us to understand the genealogy and the corporate genealogy of that term, where it comes from, and what function it serves currently. Then I will subject that term, as it currently exists, to a critique, which will not be very extensive. Then I will talk a little bit about the role that technology companies and the technology sector more broadly plays in supporting contemporary capitalism, which has run into quite a lot of problems. So we'll also give you a brief theory of how Silicon Valley fits into capitalism of today, where it stands vis-a-vis institutions like Wall Street, where it stands vis-a-vis institutions like governments. And I will conclude by giving you an overview of what an alternative digital, smart, data-intensive city might look like that will not be tied to a couple of corporate players and that will not default to an extremely neoliberal set of premises about who owns data, whether data should be treated as a commodity, and whether we should be relying on the likes of Uber, Airbnb, or Google to run our cities. So that's quite an intensive plan that we have for today, and I hope we will not get lost along the path. If you do get lost, signal to me, and I will try to situate you where we are in the narrative. So to go to part one of what I have promised, the genealogy of the smart city, I think you have to understand two things about its origins. First of all, there are two sources that are very important for understanding where a lot of this linguistic innovation comes from in the last 30 years. Right? One of them is the discourse around technology, and the second one is the discourse around cities. So if you look at the discourse around technology, that's a very complex historical issue, but nonetheless, you would probably notice that we are drowning in concepts and terms that seem to be thrown at us almost every year. Big data, sharing economy, Internet of Things, smart city. There seems to be, algorithmic regulation, open government, open data. You can probably continue that list almost indefinitely, right? There is something very odd happening in terms of how these mini narratives pop up. Right? They appear almost out of nowhere, and they usually try to zero in on a particular trend or phenomenon or a problem to which somebody in the technology sector usually has a solution to sell. Right? So there is always a matching set of solutions going with big data. If there is too much data, there is a fantastic new cloud-based database to help you handle it. If there is a problem with, the sharing economy, there is a company or platform like Uber and Airbnb eager to come in, step in, and resolve it. There is an entire, almost, intellectual industrial complex that is responsible for producing and solidifying and circulating those buzzwords. Much of it happens in North America, but increasingly it's spreading to Europe. Right? So there is, an industry of books, pamphlets, essays, conferences, and so forth, which produces nothing but buzzwords, which then find themselves into brochures of major corporations, and through brochures, they find themselves into budgets of various public institutions who are now expected to surround themselves with the latest solution on offer. Thus, to zero in on some of the parts of this intellectual industrial complex, in the case of the smart city, we have so-called smart city expos, right, which are big conferences where technology vendors get together. What they do is that they usually sponsor and fly in the city administrators, elected politicians, to come and visit those smart city expos, usually held in fantastic cities like Barcelona. In the meantime, there is some kind of a conference component going on, and a bunch of intellectuals discuss issues about the future of the world, while in the back rooms there are lots of deals struck between those companies and the public administrations. Right? So this is more or less how the smart city discourse propagates. Right? I mean, there are many other institutions. I'm just giving you some anecdotal evidence to situate you into its genealogy. So this is the sort of technological origins of that buzzword, the smart city. There is also, of course, the urban origin. of it, right? And as I mentioned, there are two big sources of this buzzwords these days. One of them is Silicon Valley and technology. The other one is the cities. And any of you who has worked on urbanism wouldn't fail to notice that you have as many urban gurus walking around talking about creative cities or sustainable cities or how mayors will rule the world as you have technological gurus who go around telling us how Google or Uber are the future of the economy. So a similar thing has been happening, as I've said, in this domain of urbanity where there is this constant pressure now on cities to not just be creative or to be sustainable or to be green, but also to compete with each other, right? And you have a similar industrial, sort of intellectual industrial complex, in this case, made up mostly of consulting firms that have taken upon the job of ranking cities against each other, trying to understand which of them are more creative, which of them are less creative, and as any good consulting company knows, the next thing you need to do after producing a ranking is to come up with a solution how a city can improve their standing in the ranking. So what we have seen happen in the case of sort of urban cases is that you have virtually all of the big consulting firms from Deloitte to McKinsey set up urban institutes and city institutes within themselves and now work almost exclusively with city administrations on helping them improve themselves, right? So given this context, and I'm simplifying a lot, you can see that a concept like the smart city finds itself on rather fertile territory. Right? So on the one hand, you have technology firms like Cisco, like HP, like Microsoft, which for various reasons need to find new markets for their products. Right? So in the case of IBM, which I think is the easiest case to understand, you have a company that has spent more than a decade building this thing called Watson, right, which is an artificial intelligence engine, which was supposed to be key to the future of IBM and help them do things that no one else can do. I mean, so far it has just won a computer game on television, and it seems to be its greatest achievement. But IBM needs to justify all the billions that have been poured into developing Watson. So what does IBM do? They come up with a new buzzword called cognitive computing, and they say that cognitive computing is key to virtually everything, and it's especially key to the cities. So they build up smart city practice, and now they're supposed to convince cities that basically one way to become smart is to find a way to deploy Watson to make their buses run on time, or to basically query the local administration to see why your garbage was not picked up. So you can actually send a message in some, they rolled it out in some cities in Canada. You can send a message to a city administration, and Watson somehow will step into the process, understand your query, and inform you why your garbage is still where it is, as if that will somehow help you survive that mess. So again, that's just the context, right? So the context, I think, here is by now should be quite well understood. By 2008, 2009, we have an invasion of smart city rhetoric and brochures that are being presented to cities as more or less salvation to whatever problem ails them. And those problems can be quite extensive, ranging from their desire to save on energy costs. So you can introduce all sorts of sensors and all sorts of machine learning techniques in order to understand where energy is wasted, to saving other types of resources, water, so forth, garbage collection. The ultimate dream is to have, which already has been employed in cities like Boston, is to have trash cans which can notify the trash collection company when the trash cans are full, so that the bus will optimize its route to pick them up. I mean, you have such sort of nice and somewhat trivial deployments of such technologies, which of course cost a lot of money. And then, the sky is the limit, and the sort of exact nature of the technological firm and the products that it's selling will define the pitch and the actual product, right? So in the case of IBM, the idea of the smart city will always be tied to this vision of cognitive computing. In the case of a company like Cisco, which primarily makes routers and connectivity devices, it will always be tied to the idea of connectivity. So they would like to build real-time devices and real-time systems that will tell a city how many tourists are in its parks, right? So you can actually better do crowd management. So you can actually better distribute resources. Again, the perennial hope is that we'll be able to manage garbage better. So you can put more trash cans in certain zones of the park where the tourists congregate, right? It's the small, tiny, little logistical improvements to how the city operates. Right, and then there are variations, which I think, again, are mostly trivial, but they get hold of the consumer imagination quite quickly. So the cities of Copenhagen and Amsterdam, for example, have been experimenting with a system of smart streetlights, right, where when it's raining, your street light, traffic light, knows that it's raining, and it knows that you're on a bicycle. So the waiting time for you, given that it's raining on a bicycle, will be shorter than to the person in the car, right? Then again, you think about it and you say, well, it's great, right? What's there not to like? If I'm the bicyclist, finally I'll be able to spend less time getting wet in the rain time, right? So such small organizational improvements, you can think of them quite, I think, easily, and there will be many more, given that everything can now be interconnected, and thanks to that interconnection, all sorts of savings and new efficiencies can be generated. Right? So that, I think, is the state of the smart cities so far as of today. By and large, it's a corporate-driven effort to impose all sorts of rationalization and efficiency producing technologies on cities, which come, of course, with a lot of costs, which are not just costs that are monetary, they are also costs that are political and democratic, because clearly there are a lot of other commitments that have to be made. Cities have to sign deals, which often are multi-year deals. So you'll have to commit yourself to a product from Cisco, not just for a year or for 2 years, but for 10 or 20 years, right? Given that it's getting increasingly harder for public institutions to opt out of corporate contracts that they sign. And that will become even harder if Europe signs up to all of the trade treaties like TTIP, TISA, and many others. It will actually not be that easy for a new administration elected in a radical city, for example, to basically say, we don't want to be dealing with Cisco anymore. We want to manage our water or garbage on our own. Right? Because then a company like Cisco, under the new conditions in this new trade treaties, will actually be able to go and sue the city and claim damages and thus make even more money, right, by providing no services whatsoever. Then there are many other commitments, right? There is the problem that most of the technologies that they sell are proprietary technologies, right, which have customer lock-in. There is no way for you to move from one vendor to another, as I have describe the situation to you with the Smart City Expos as sort of meeting places between the industry and governments. What often happens there is that there are very shady tender processes. Very often there are no tender processes, and citizens find themselves committed to a platform that they cannot modify. They have no ability to look inside it. They have no idea to understand what algorithms power it. They have no idea to understand what kind of biases might already be built into the algorithms, right? And again, when we are thinking about trivial things, like understanding whether it's raining while you are on a bicycle, the exact workings of that algorithm probably wouldn't matter. But, last year I was doing a documentary about data for Al Jazeera, and we went to see one of the offices of IBM in New York. And I had to sit there with one of their senior engineers and, of course, his PR handler. And they were explaining to me all of the good things that will come as IBM technology saturates our cities. And one of the projects and ideas that they pitched me was that finally, thanks to sensors, which now are quite advanced, and you're not just looking at weather, you can also be looking at, facial expressions. So you can actually be more or less understanding, heat maps. You can be understanding how we feel. You can make a prediction about our emotional state or the emotional state of people in a certain area. And they were telling me that, well, finally, we would actually be able to understand how happy or unhappy people in a certain place feel. And of course, if you're pitching it to city administrators, I mean, what's there not to like? Right? And the immediate question I asked them was, well, okay, suppose you sell it to a city like Baltimore in the United States, which happens to be a place where a lot of black, radical, young people tend to riot quite often because of police brutality. Right? What if the police identifies that in a certain area of the city, there are quite a lot of unhappy people getting together in the public square? What's going to happen then? And it's a question that the IBM's PR handler immediately suppressed. But I think you can understand the implications, right? That ultimately, as you move to a world of predictive analytics, where a lot of this data will be harvested and harnessed in order to make assessments, not just about how to allocate trivial resources like garbage trucks, which might not be trivial in some Italian cities, but as you also allocate things like police forces, right? And as you make decisions about whom to lock up, whom to grab preemptively, how are you going to deal with the problem like refugees, right? Which also now increasingly is a new pitch to a lot of these technology companies. IBM has pitched one of its predictive policing technologies to German authorities precisely to deal with the refugees, and they claim that they can recognize a refugee who might be threatening to the public order just by analyzing and comparing their biometrics and their face. Right? I mean, you have to understand, we aren't just talking about trivial distribution of resources, because once you put these sensors and once you put these technologies out there into the public sphere, so to say, they can be harnessed for all sorts of purposes. Right? And of course, we are kind of intuitively understand it with our phones when FBI and law enforcement agencies come and demand to open them up. But think about universalizing that infrastructure and putting it virtually everywhere in the built environment and in the cities where we are. Right? It has huge implications, and the kinds of algorithms you built into that system to make predictions, you don't want just to leave their design to the likes of IBM. Right? And there is no way to currently introduce much transparency into how they're designed and how they function. Right? So there are all sorts of problems with these corporate solutions, right? And I don't want to drag about that too far. All I want to say is that at this point, the smart city represents a program that is primarily driven by corporations, that does not necessarily favor the interests of the citizens, that is conducted in a manner that is virtually untransparent, and that at its heart has two big rationales. One rationale is to do more with less, right? Which is, I think, it's a famous, you can attribute it to many people. People like Buckminster Fuller is often credited with that kind of engineering motto that you can do more with less. But, I think if Margaret Thatcher had to invent that slogan as a slogan for austerity agenda, she would also be quite happy with do more with less, because ultimately this is what technology allows you to do. It allows you to do more with less, right? And I think that we have to understand that rationale. And the second rationale, which I mentioned, is just policing, right? And one of the more advanced installations of the smart city technologies is a city like Rio de Janeiro, where you can actually go and see these giant operation rooms where you have data pulled in from all sorts of monitors to police units, where decisions are made about how to deploy and redeploy police throughout the city. Right? So let's just stop there. You understood what I have to say about the corporate-driven smart city. Let's just move on to the second part, which I promised you, which is how the technology sector as a whole fits into contemporary capitalism. Because unless you fail to understand that, we will miss the real problems facing the cities for fighting this kind of buzzword-driven trivia coming from corporations. Right? And I think this is the mistake made by a lot of other critics of the smart city. Right? There are a lot of, well, not a lot, but there are 2 or 3 books that now critically engage with the smart city as an idea. And basically, most of them leave their discussion at the level of reading the brochures of these technology firms. Of course, if you just read the brochures of IBM and Cisco, you will find that, as any brochure, it's primarily marketing speak, and it has no critical substance. And it's not meant to have that critical substance, because no administrator striking deals with those companies actually read those brochures. Right? Those brochures are just distributed for legitimation purposes. They have no actual critical substance to them. But I don't think that it's correct to stop our critique of the smart city at just level of reading the brochures, because there are clearly a lot of effects that the deployment of technologies, not just by the likes of Cisco, HP, and IBM, but also by the likes of Uber, Airbnb, Google, and many others, not to mention drones and 3D printers, will have on how we live in cities, how we organize production, how we organize our common activities. And this is the part that I think is important for us to understand, because unless we understand where the real threats to the city come from, aside from these corporate deals, we will never be able to articulate an alternative agenda, right? So for the rest of my talk, I would like to get you to a point where you can understand where I think the real threats come from, regardless of whether they are called the smart city right now or not. They clearly have to do with Silicon Valley, and they clearly have to do with technology, and also try to outline what are some of the ways to fight back. So let me step back a little bit from the cities and talk about what's happening with technology and capitalism as a whole. So since we are at the Festival of the Economy, I think actually I would be justified to take this little detour. So my overall theory of how Silicon Valley and its offer fits into contemporary capitalism is as follows. So if you look at the ways in which capitalism has traditionally dealt with its crisis, right? How it has dealt with some of its most vulnerable moments, right? It has always found a way to more or less extend its life by making all sorts of compromises and finding allies in places which you would not necessarily think about as its natural allies, right? If you look at the emergence of the welfare state, right, across Europe, but also in America with Great Society, there was clearly, it was not, you know, if you listen to a lot of commentary in America, for example, you would think that the welfare state is some kind of an invention by the communists in the Soviet Union to destroy capitalism, right? Which, of course, it's not. From the very beginning, if you go and read the fundamental text written, you know, the Beveridge Report and many other texts written by the architects of the welfare state in Britain, but also in Sweden, Germany, and elsewhere, you will see that the welfare state from the very beginning was established as a way to strengthen capitalism from its internal crisis and its turbulence, right? So you actually wanted to have a way to socialize things like insurance, education, and healthcare in order to have a workforce that would continuously return to work despite whatever crisis and hits that might have hit the economy, right? It was also matched with a Keynesian economic agenda of focusing on stimulating aggregate demand. And as a result, you had 30 or 40 years of quite spectacular growth in both Europe and America, which is a period which ended by the early 1970s. Right? Then capitalism had run into another crisis, the roots of which, of course, are numerous and probably well known to many of you, which have to do with the deregulation of finance and the regulation of capital flows. It has to do with the oil crisis that was happening in the Middle East. It has to do with the war in Vietnam and the need to finance it, the growing student movement, and so forth. I'm not going to give you a history of sort of capitalism condensed here, but I think we understand that something happened in the early 70s. And the solution to that crisis, right, if you follow the rhetoric of and the work of people like Wolfgang Strick or Colin Crouch, is that governments eventually, sooner or later, turned to debt, right? So they found an ally in the finance and banking industry whose activities were deregulated, but since it was deregulated, first, if you follow, for example, Wolfgang Strick's argument, it was mostly by having governments borrow more and more money to pay for the things that they could no longer afford themselves, or it was by having citizens borrow more and more to buy houses, to buy cars, to buy all the things that they came to expect from a well-functioning economy, but could no longer afford because their real incomes were stagnating. Right? So, I mean, this is the overall, I think, background which does make sense, which, to use the terms of Wolfgang Strick again, allowed capitalism to buy time. Right? So he talks about buying time. So there were many mechanisms of buying time, right? And that was one of those mechanisms. Colin Crouch, on the other hand, talks about privatized Keynesianism, right? And what he means by that is that ultimately it was primarily through the wider availability of private credit, private debt that all of us could suddenly get, regardless of whether we actually were eligible for it, right, which ultimately then led to the financial crisis and the housing crisis, that capitalism continued functioning, right, and continued expanding and gave us all an illusion that things were working fine. Right? What I would like to argue, and again, I'm skipping over a lot of conceptual and historical territory, is that by 2008, 2009, it was obvious that A, capitalism had hit a new crisis, and B, that the traditional ways of dealing with it, which A, first was the welfare state, which itself got traditionally kind of withered away and shrunk, and that were no longer capable of offering that way out. And it was exactly to technology firms in Silicon Valley that capitalism now looks in order to save itself. So in a sense, the argument I'm making more broadly, which at this point is very connected to cities but stands also on its own, is that ultimately it is Silicon Valley and technology firms which offer any hope not just of salvation to our leaders and elites, but also at least give them some rhetorical chance of justifying what it is that they do, because they are the only industry capable of indicating and signposting any kind of possible bright future that does not end in complete misery, people losing their jobs, everything becoming privatized, and us losing benefits like healthcare and education. You will not count on any other industry, banks, oil firms, production firms, construction firms, to come up with any positive narrative that can justify capitalism at this point. It's extremely hard. The only industry that is capable of projecting that nicer future and reconciling all the problems and all the internal crises is the technology firms, right? And that's the broader background, and I'll explain to you what exactly I mean in the next 5 minutes, and then I'll move again back to the cities, because city as a unit forms an important part in this project of salvation. So how will that salvation come about? So this is where we really need to understand what is the offer that Silicon Valley and technology firms make at this point. If you look at a company like Google or Facebook, right, and those are two firms which all of you probably use in your daily life, if not Facebook, but at least Google, right? How does Google work? Right, we all know how it works. You go, you type in a search, or you use its email, and suddenly the results appear, and what's even better, nobody has to pay for it, right? Right? So you get your search needs satisfied for free. You get your communication needs satisfied for free. I mean, what happened there? Wasn't capitalism supposed to work differently? We were supposed to be paying for everything, and we were told that privatization will result in us having to pay for more and more things, more and more goods. We'll have to be paying more and more money out of our own pockets. Well, of course, we know what's happening there, and it's that you have the advertising industry subsidize the provision of many of those goods and services. Right? How? Because Google also collects the data about you in the process of offering those services, and that data then can be profitably sold, or an auction can be organized around that data so that an advertiser will subsidize what it is that you are doing with a company and a service like Google or Facebook. Clearly, if you think back 15 or 20 years ago, the way in which we paid to satisfy our information and communication needs was paid for very differently. Right? We did have institutions like libraries, universities, post offices, which did not rely on advertising to pay for themselves. Right? They relied on taxes, and they relied on stamps. For example, they relied on subsidies in order to offer services to cities. Right? When you went to the post office didn't tell you, well, we'll let you mail that letter for free if you let us open it, read it, and then insert an advertising inside it, and then forward it on. I mean, that was a possible model through which you could have offered a service like that, right? And in retrospect, as our real incomes are stagnating and many of us are losing jobs and we can no longer afford to pay for many of the things we could pay for in the past, I think that compromise would actually look much more appealing today than it did 20 years ago. Why? Because we have less money to spend on such things. Right? So that's just a little aside. What I would like to argue is that essentially that model of having advertising subsidize more and more goods and services through data collection lies at the heart of a much broader and wider expansion of Silicon Valley as the provision of many other services. If you have followed the news closely, you might have noticed that last month there was a big scandal in the United Kingdom when it was discovered that the country's National Health Service, right, basically the country's primary welfare institution that everybody in Britain is proud of, even the conservatives, has been given the data of patients, 4 or 5 million people, to Google, right? Why? Because Google has promised that its artificial intelligence unit, called DeepMind, would be able to analyze that data and would be able to derive all sorts of interesting insights from it about how and what kind of people are likely to develop kidney disease, right? The reason why a company like Google is capable of making such predictions is because they managed to basically suck in so much data that they have developed advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence capacities that are not available to anybody else, including the National Health Service and probably even including most of the other government or even private institutions out there. Right? I mean, I talk about this as data extractivism, which is an interesting term, which I think is self-explanatory. But what I think you have to understand is that it's not as if when you transact with Google, they offer you an email service or a search service, and you give them your data, and then the data goes to advertising, and then nothing else happens. The data does not just go to advertisers, it also stays with Google, which allows Google to become more and more powerful and develop more and more ways and means of analyzing data, and thus becoming a powerful player in industries where they had no presence before. So they can suddenly become extremely powerful in healthcare. They can suddenly become very powerful in self-driving cars. I mean, how do self-driving cars come about? They come about primarily because Google has managed to solve two problems. One was the problem of keeping track of real-time traffic. And second one was making sure that you can actually map out all the cities and understand where everything is. Right? Crucial to that mission, if you look, for example, at the traffic data, was being able to pull the data real time from as many sensors as possible. And where do sensors come from? They come from your phones, because your Android phones are generating data that feeds into Google and allows it to develop technologies for self-driving cars, for self-autonomous parking. This is how it's done. It's this data residue that is generated in the context of using services which we take for granted and think are mostly trivial, that turns these companies more or less into sole providers of goods that have to do with automation and advanced data analytics and machine learning, which basically means that, we can still imagine a future where advertising will exist for the next 5, 50, 100 years. I think it's a future that I personally find extremely dubious, because, the moment China slows down, the ability of Google to generate as much money from ads goes down as well. The moment the global economy slows down, the advertising market also becomes extremely volatile. The moment somebody invents an app to block ads in your browser, which has already happened, and a lot of people are already using, that market also shrinks. To assume that that market somehow rests on extremely solid foundations, I think is ridiculous. Right? And if you assume that advertising market will not be forever, then you have to start wondering what will happen once Google is the only company capable of analyzing what it is that is happening with your health data and how you can actually provide insights around it, and there is nobody else capable of doing that. Well, it's quite simple to understand. They start charging, and they start charging for services which they are the only company capable of providing. Right? So that's just the context that I think will help you understand that we are not moving to a world where everything is free. We're moving to a world where a couple of companies will control the key resource in this new economy, which is data, and they will be in a position to dictate feudal-like terms to the rest of us, because there will be nobody else around to challenge them. Right? So, but that is just one of the ways. I mean, I can continue. I mean, Google itself makes a fascinating case. I mean, if you look at how they managed to integrate all the different data points that you generate while using their platforms and their apps, you'll be amazed. I mean, there is a new app called Google Goals, which tells you how they want to turn you into this extremely productive individual, who works in Silicon Valley, builds startups, wakes up very early and jogs 3 times a day. I mean, it's called Google Goals, which already should give you some sort of pause for reflection. What does Google Goals does? It analyzes your activity on all Google services, including Google Calendar, right? Including Google Mail, right? And it tries to identify, and you know how Google Calendar works now. So when Google Calendar sees that you have a plane reservation, that you've bought a plane ticket, or that you have a meeting that you've discussed with somebody, it automatically adds that meeting, and it adds that plane reservation, and it adds that hotel booking to a calendar. So you don't even need a secretary anymore, because all of that is done automatically thanks to the data and artificial intelligence that these firms have built. Right? So, and this is already a lot of people using it. My phone does it for me. I don't even have to do anything. All I have to do is just to consume, and all my calendar will be filled in with appointments and commitments automatically. What does Google Goals do? You basically tell it at the beginning of the week, well, this week, I would like to spend an hour studying foreign languages. I would like to spend 2 hours jogging. And Google Goals then searches for little gaps in your calendar, which is already filled in with commitments automatically, and tells you, well, Thursday afternoon, 4 o'clock, great time to study languages. Friday morning, 7 a.m., go jogging, you have a free hour. Right? And again, that ties to the kind of broader dream and utopian vision of virtual assistants that Google is building, which, to a lot of people in Europe, of course, sounds ridiculous, but they do enjoy quite a lot of popularity in the States, and I would argue that for cultural reasons, this is something I cannot discuss now, but we clearly have to understand the strong cultural influence and cultural force that these technology companies and firms have over young people. Right? And I don't want to sound here like, I'm an old man here complaining about the corruption of our young people, but there is clearly a very strong soft power, which, is combined with technological power that also shapes behavior to a significant extent that I think we have to be aware of. All I'm trying to say here is that there is clearly a new infrastructure for solving problems and making system more efficient and more effective that this new technology, digital platforms provide. I can give you many more examples, but I would like to shift gears a little bit and show you the other way, through which it's not just by deriving more efficiency from our health system or from our education system, where companies like Google are also powerful players, because now they run all the email systems of most of the universities in the world, also sucking in all the data about our education, by the way, to a different kind of a helping hand that technology firms provide. And this is where we need to understand that the proliferation of sensors and real-time ubiquitous connectivity also allows us to basically turn every single moment of our life and every single possession that we have either into a commercial activity of sorts or into some kind of a commodity that can be traded on the global market, right? And this is where companies like Uber and Airbnb do present themselves as temporary means of getting by in a financial and economic crisis that is getting worse and worse, right? What do I mean here? Basically, the pitch that Uber and Airbnb make, and if you go and listen and read their testimony and their public statements closely, you will see that repeated in a statement after statement, so I can only assume it's an organized campaign. What they say is that we are with the middle classes who have been hit by the crisis, and they've been hit by the crisis so harsh that they need to be able to make a supplementary income. How would they make that? Well, they can drive an Uber car after they're done with the day job, which, of course, nobody has, but Uber pretends that, it's a supplementary job. Or you can put your apartment on Airbnb, and when you go out to have a holiday, you can actually make some money by renting out your room or by renting out your apartment. Or, suppose you have a power drill that you're not using. You can put your power drill also in global circulation, and one of your neighbors can come and pay for it. Virtually everything that you have, your free time, your possessions now, can be turned into something that can be traded and make money for you, right? Previously, it was very hard to pull off because of very high transaction costs, and and this is how they put it. I was just, I hope this person is not here. I was just in Germany at a conference in Weimar, and I was on a panel with two extremely neoliberal economists who were all trying to explain the sharing economy by basically saying that, well, now the transactions costs have lowered, we can all become entrepreneurs. We can all be selling ourselves to Uber and Airbnb, and the reason why we didn't do it in the past is because the transaction costs were too high. Right? To anybody who is not an economist trained in a certain tradition, it would become obvious that if you have a stable 9-to-5 job and you are paid a decent income, there is no reason to drive an Uber car between the hours of 11 and 3 a.m. Or leave your apartment for the weekend so that you can earn some money by staying with your parents. People who have affluence provided to them through their day job, probably do not need to be entrepreneurs, which is a nice euphemism for hustling also in this case, right? So I think we have to be cognizant of the way in which these two processes, on the one hand, deriving more efficiency from the system by extracting as much data as possible, in the case of firms like Google, and by essentially turning everything from your free time to your possessions into tradable commodities in the market, does generate a certain robustness and a certain, how should I put it, resilience in a system which is otherwise under immense pressure because it can no longer deliver jobs, it can no longer deliver decent incomes, and can no longer deliver much by way of, sustainability, right? And where would Silicon Valley fit into all of this? They also have a search solution now, and it's just amazing how quickly they managed to completely sort of turn around even radical ideas and embrace them as their own. Who now is the greatest proponent of basic income in America? It's Silicon Valley, right? It's them who now have become the greatest advocates of citizen income, basic citizen income, however you want to call it, unconditional basic income. And they are the ones funding experiments. One of the big venture capital firms have just announced they're going to run a basic income experiment in Oakland. An idea that has traditionally, let's forget the libertarian support for it, but an idea that has traditionally been supported by extremely radical leftist forces in this country, especially, has now been embraced by venture capitalists. Now, how did that happen? Well, it happens for very good reasons. A, it makes perfect sense to a company like Uber, for example, to be behind basic income. Why? Because it will be a very fantastic way for them to say that, look, our drivers are not here because they need a job. They have basic income. They're here because they love socializing. And they're here because they love driving. And they're here because they would like to make some supplementary income. Who's going to pay for basic income? Not us, because we don't want to pay all the taxes we owe. That's why we engage in all sorts of tax optimization schemes. So let somebody else pay for basic income, and we'll reap its rhetorical benefits. At the same time, we will invent a new generation of firms that will deploy the sensors and the ubiquitous connectivity in order to find new ways to charge us for the use of resources that has previously been priced differently. And this is a very important part. If you want to understand what is driving Internet of Things, right? You might think, well, it's all these people who want to understand when the garbage cans are full, right? It's incorrect. What is driving the Internet of Things are giant German conglomerates like Siemens and Bosch, right? Why do they do it? Because they have understood that if they can build systems which have sensors in them, and if they can incorporate them with technologies like Bitcoin and its underlying technology like blockchain, they can actually start charging people per use for everything. If you go to London and use the metro there, you're familiar with the Oyster card, right? Where you have to go and basically swap your card, and then whatever you're going to pay, you have no idea what you're going to pay. Because it's just impossible to have a cognitive map of all the charges that you're going to accrue as you enter in one point, exit in another point, you take the bus, then you have to change. This is the paradigm of metered use, right? Those of you who are unfortunate enough to live with metered other utilities, you would know what it is, even though with metered utilities, at least there is some transparency. This new breed of startups that are now emerging, partly funded and sponsored by these giant technology firms like Bosch and Siemens, they want to promote this pay-as-you-go model, where your sofa, once you sit on a sofa in some public space or your private space, is going to charge you for how long you sat on the sofa. right? And once you can incorporate some kind of emotional analysis into it, you can also charge you for how much you have actually enjoyed the sofa. No, but I mean, like, you might be laughing, but this is the paradigm, right? And applied to public space, that would be the paradigm of how you're going to pay for public benches, which the city, drowning in austerity, would no longer be able to provide, right? And I think that under this paradigm, something like basic income makes a lot of sense to Silicon Valley. Because ultimately, you give people a bunch of money to pay for all the benches and all the sofas for which they're going to have to pay, now that you have a ways to basically detect and charge them for metered use. Right? So we have to understand that this is the sort of very bizarre, newer kind of feudal welfare state into which we are heading, where on the one hand, you have companies like Google overtaking fields like education, healthcare, to some extent transportation, not to mention telecommunication services where we search for information and exchange information as well. A lot of that will be subsidized in the near term by the advertising industry, as I've said, right? All of that is done to extract as much data as quick as possible to develop advanced tools of artificial intelligence, as I have already said, right? Which also, by the way, means that at this point, global advertising industry functions as something like privatized Manhattan Project for artificial intelligence. Right? We don't have an ambitious project to fund artificial intelligence and make it work for the people. Right? So we have advertisers step in and subsidize Google's efforts to develop a giant AI system which only they were able to use in a much more advanced manner than IBM's cognitive computing nonsense, to basically help us optimize the services like healthcare, which governments would no longer be able to finance and run to the same extent as they could. And Google will promise to do it much better. And this is also very important to understand. And the key tweak in these new systems that market themselves as free and kind of welfare enhancing, even though they're in private hands, the key idea there is basically regulating the individual. Right? I mean, that, I would argue, is the slogan of the new deregulated neoliberal capitalism in which we live. It's deregulate the industry, overregulate the individual, right? Because that's the only way to compensate for the consequences of living the industries unregulated. So you leave the energy industry, do what they want. You leave the financial industry, do what they want. You leave the pharmaceutical industry, do what they want. Clearly, by now, it's very hard. You let, the food industry do what they want. By now, you clearly see that it's not the free market utopia that we were promised at the beginning. You have climate change, you have obesity, you have, all sorts of financial problems, people being given irresponsible loans and so forth. Right? But since regulating those firms is no longer an option, and the system needs to cope with the crisis, the only solution out there on the table is to focus on the only unit of the system that you can still regulate, which at this point is the individual and is the citizen. Right? So you would like to nudge the citizen to consume less electricity, even though energy companies can do whatever they want. You would like to nudge the individual to eat healthy food, even though big food and big pharma will continue advertising the way they want. You would like to nudge the individual to spend and borrow responsibly, even though the financial industry will be coming up with all sorts of financial products which are dubious and completely unregulated. And you will be nudging the individual because you cannot be doing anything else to any other actor of the system. Right? And what's the best way to nudge the individual? To deploy the rhetoric of and the vocabulary of behavioral economics? Well, you do it by monitoring the citizen, understanding what their weaknesses are, what their rationalities are, where they come from, and then in real time trying to steer their behavior. So every time, you're reaching for some unhealthy food, your phone buzzes off and tells you, well, if you do that, your insurance payments will go up by 10%. Probably you'll think twice. Again, if you know quite a lot about your health, and if you know quite a lot about all the other regulatory apparatuses like insurance, which regulate your behavior, you can generate nudges that are highly personalized. So you can actually regulate the individual quite nicely. Right? And I would argue that putting sensors everywhere, generating data from every single source, understanding everything that we do and collecting data about our personal behavior does allow you, more or less, to engineer the kind of behavior at the end, at the output of the system through the users, which will more or less help you hide and conceal the problems as they exist, right? And it will help you deal and at least continue and buy time, again, to use the words of Wolfgang Strick, for quite a bit of time, right? So once you incorporate everything I've said, and I'm almost finished, and you try to put it at the level of the city, which, by the way, all of those sensors, technological systems will be incorporated and already incorporated. Once you put it to the city level, where all of the infrastructures for rolling out all those pay-as-you-go systems will be, because this is where our infrastructure is. I mean, if you look at what has been happening with public infrastructure over the last 10 or 15 years all across the globe, what has been happening, cities has been selling it off because they are broke. Whom are they selling it off? They're selling it off to financial investors, big real estate firms, and a lot of them are banks. You know, it's not just consulting firms that have formed these municipal units. It's also big investment banks, which now all of them have some kind of municipal practice. And it's in their DNA to extract as much rent from those resources that they now own as possible, which explains to you which now you have to pay more and more tolls for using things that have previously been free, right? Or you paid for with your taxes. So you have this merger between an agenda of privatization and austerity and trying to basically put more and more infrastructure into private hands because public institutions are no longer capable of running them and financing them. And you have this technological infrastructure being put in place which will make it extremely efficient. And it will allow you also to personalize the prices you are charging and do a lot of other things, right? All of that is to say that cities will be the primary battleground for all of these fights, right? There will be in cities where people will be hit with this. And they are already hit. I mean, if you sort of abstract from all the technological things I've said, if you look at the protests that have been sweeping cities all over the globe, you know, you can look at the protests against the spiking transportation fares in Sao Paulo, for example, in 2013. You can see at the protests in Istanbul around Gezi Park. You can see a lot of the protests that have been happening in cities all across the globe, not to mention, of course, a huge wave of protests in Spain, which brought not just new city administrations in power in Barcelona, Madrid, and Zaragoza, but also is about to bring Podemos, probably as force number 2, into national politics. All of them have urban origins, right? Because it's at the level of the city that capitalism now more or less exploits, because nothing is produced anymore in our cities, as you might know. So it's pointless to be exploiting anyone and anything in the factory because the factories are empty, right? So the source of exploitation has moved to a very different milieu, right? So instead of being exploited at the level of production, the exploitation moved to the level of realization of value, right? So this is why we have to pay more and more in rent, we have to pay more and more in services, we have to pay more in utilities, and we will have to pay more and more for all of these data-intensive services, which will be presented to us as the foundation of some kind of new privatized welfare state, right? So the battles will be there. Let me just, in the 3 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions, lay out what I think will be key to those battles. It's obvious that without data that these companies can suck in and extract for free, nothing like that would be remotely possible. Of course, they will continue building sensors, they will continue building intelligence systems and so forth, but it's still data that allows them to offer these kinds of services, make predictions, build this advanced AI, and so forth, right? Which to me indicates that we have to completely strategically rethink data as a political entity, right? Karl Polanyi had this very interesting analysis of fictitious commodities, right, back in his Great Transformation book, where he basically said that labor and land are not commodities as such. They emerge due to social relations that are not made, or in the case of land, natural ones, they're not made to be sold, but they become commodities, they're made into commodities, right, through market transformation. So as such, he preferred to treat them as fictitious commodities that have been made into commodities, and that explains why, as capitalism solidifies, there are also protests and what he called the double movement aimed at sort of saving them from the commodity status. Right? I would argue that we need to apply the same paradigm to data, more or less. Ultimately, data emerges not because there is Google or IBM or Facebook or Cisco out there with sensors to capture it. We generate data as we engage in social relations. You know, when I go to catch a bus, I do generate data about me going to catch a bus. When I get on a bus, I also generate data. When I go see a doctor, I generate data. I generate data as a product of being me, right? And as a product of engaging with the world out there. The problem is that I do not have the infrastructure, neither as an individual, nor as a unit of a political community, to harvest, harness, and act upon that data. Right? Which means that it all ends up in the hands of a giant technology firms, which then package my data with the data of my neighbors and then with the data of my fellow citizens and build extremely sophisticated products, which then sell back to me, right? With my taxpayers' money, which I pay to my city administrations, paying to them to buy the data that I myself have generated. Right? I mean, this is not some hypothetical example. I can give you a very specific example. In America already, you have cities, Portland, for example, in America, has recently struck a deal with a technology company that produces sensors that bicyclists use to monitor where they go. Right? So you use a sensor in your, some kind of tracking technology, which allows you to show where most of the biking paths are in the city, which are the biking paths are most popular with bicyclists, right? So the city of Portland paid $20,000, not a lot, but still paid, to buy that data from a company that basically takes data that the city itself should already be aggregating a long time ago and should actually be having as a right and not as a commodity purchased from a third party which just happens to be making and manufacturing sensors. The same thing happened with Uber. But the city of Boston was about to regulate Uber, and they said, well, look, guys, we would like to regulate you. And Uber said, well, we actually have something to offer you. We have data about all the traffic jams and about all the traffic congestion in Boston. Would you like us to share it with you for free? And the city of Boston said yes, and of course, no regulation followed. Right, which explains to you that in many tricky areas, data also emerges as a powerful bargaining tool, right, which allows these technology companies to extract a lot of additional benefits and a lot of additional data. Because you can come to a city like Barcelona and say, oh, great, we'll give you data about traffic. Can you give us data about energy costs or energy generation in your city? And if you're a city that really needs data about traffic, you'll give it up, right? All of it is to say that the only way for us to be able to move out and get out of this path towards increased financialization and privatization of our lives by means of technology is to politicize data and to treat it not as a commodity, but to treat it as a public good that should primarily accrue not just to us as individuals as private property, but should accrue to us as people living in a community, whether it's in the neighborhood or in the city. I'm not talking about your private data, about whom you email and what you sent. I'm not talking about your health data. I'm talking about data that is generated in the context of using public services, using public infrastructure, and using kind of, public social relations that all of us still have, before we get completely sucked into using tools like Google Goals, which will tell us, when we need to jog and when we need to do what, and thus all the social ties disintegrate completely. So I will stop here. Again, we deviated somewhat from the idea of the smart city, in part because, as I hope I have convinced you, this is not the main issue. The main issue in our cities is something else. And we have to tackle it rather than just be fighting this sort of empty marketing brochure speak that technology companies throw at us. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Devo parlare italiano. Allora, io ovviamente vi chiedo di alzare la mano, però ho
I'd like to throw the floor open, but I'd like to ask questions myself, and I hope that my questions are the same as the one that you'd like to ask. We've been presenting with a very alarming scenario, very stimulating indeed, as questions or what is happening at the time. Well, thank God you haven't talked about Facebook, at least for once. So we've been spared that, because usually whenever internet is quoted, Facebook goes with it. Now we've talked about smart city, we've talked about other cities, the technology companies, and not not Facebook. Facebook seems to be the only platform that sees us as very present as Italian citizens. I must say that many questions came to mind listening to your presentation. The first one is, what is the solution that you put forward, that we can either opt in or opt out of this, but forgoing all what we've been doing so far, it is pretty difficult. I believe that even Morozov uses all these technologies, so you are already in an opt-in situation. Or have you chosen otherwise? Have you opted out of all these services? In Italy, we think about access to the web as a main objective. We're only dealing with problems where we don't have enough bandwidth, where we don't grant access to all our citizens. So apparently, Italy is yet a country that cannot equip itself with all the intelligent and smart technology that we've been hearing about. So do you think that as Italians not being connected 100%, do you think that we're lucky not being connected? And what do you think about the battle for the neutrality of the web? What do you think about the proposal that was put forward by scholars that have identified the problem of privacy as we become a commodity as soon as we accept services that are given out for free? There are scholars saying that the only solution, that the only possibility is for software to be given for free. Free software is often referred to as having a role in that. So do you think that having free software, non-proprietary software, could actually be a solution, so as to let citizens free to make their decisions? So these are a few questions, but I'd like to start these. I start with these, and then more questions will come from the floor.
So, with regards to Facebook, it's true that they're missing from some of the battles that are now being fought, but they're also present in many others. So in terms of investments in artificial intelligence, Facebook is quite ahead. They are a very active player in artificial intelligence. They're also a very active player in sort of peripheral aspects of this new privatized welfare state that I have outlined, especially in the developing world. If you have followed any of the scandals regarding Internet.org or Free Basics, which is Facebook's system of providing so-called free internet in the developing world, that has generated a lot of resistance, and India basically said no. India said no to the offer of free internet from Facebook because, of course, it wasn't free. It was Facebook, it was Facebook stepping in and basically saying that we would like to subsidize the provision of internet to poor people in India, only that a handful of sites would be free, including Facebook, of course, and a couple of others. For everything else, they will have to pay. And, of course, people in India, especially a lot of the advocates who have been working on net neutrality, have seen that it's going to completely sort of balance the playing field, because ultimately people with money will be able to see any websites that they want, and poor people will be limited to just Facebook. So ultimately you're building a paradigm where for many people the only internet that exists will be Facebook. Right, which then means that all of the other services, education, health, banking, will have to go through Facebook. So people will be building apps to be on Facebook, which, again, for Facebook makes a lot of sense, but it tells you how this new welfare-like regime functions. They'll be happy to offer you subsidized to even free services in exchange for the data that they will later suck out of you, which fits very well with what I've said. The other thing Facebook does, of course, is virtual reality, which is the ultimate solution to whatever problems you have in your life. You can be living also in a basement without seeing any daylight, but if you have fantastic virtual reality on your head, I mean, gee, you can be in Hawaii, right? I mean, that's the that's the other sort of way out from that Facebook would like us to believe in. That, you know, ultimately that's one of the ways to make our otherwise grim lives somewhat pleasant. On other questions, with regards to solutions, again, I think I've been trying to map out a very intellectually and historically ambitious landscape and terrain which explains the problem. If you really buy into my argument that, you know, there is a crisis in capitalism, the Silicon Valley offers some kind of a temporary solution, then you also have to work at that scale, and you have to understand that, as I am a big fan of many of those technologies, but technologies for me are different from corporations owning those technologies. You know, you can have e-readers that will be produced and subsidized by libraries. I mean, what's there exactly at stake? I mean, yes, it would be great if we could have that. It would be great if we could have a lot of other devices and a lot of other systems and networks that will allow us to do what we want. I mean, just to give you an example, in Finland, there is a law that when they stop you when you're speeding up, right? And so you are breaking the law because you're driving too fast. And if you happen to be a billionaire, your fine will be probably 3 million. If you're a poor person, your fine will be €5. Fantastic. You put sensors everywhere. You connect everyone's tax data to the database. All the billionaires will end up paying far more money. Great. I mean, what city in Europe is going to do that? Right? That requires a political power and a political project to go along with that. You can use this infrastructure for a lot of different ends, but that requires first a political project that A, wants to challenge the elites, that wants to challenge the concentration of inequality among the rich, that wants to challenge financial capital and so forth. You cannot just do it by saying that we would like to build some kind of, you know, bottom-up decentralized technologies at a maker fair. I mean, as much as I would like to hear it, like, this is not going to work. Because what's lacking here also, if you really buy into the argument that advertising industry at this point is the privatized Manhattan Project for artificial intelligence, there is no way that you can actually fund an alternative without having an organized industrial policy, not just in a single country, but in an entire continent of Europe. Europe does not have an industrial policy. It has a protectionist policy protecting a couple of firms that happen to be national incumbents in most cases, and that's it. There is no effort to think through how you can run things differently because there is no willingness to challenge the underlying logic, which at this point, you know, it's not that we are trying to rethink how capitalism should function. We are trying to rethink how we can actually deal with the consequences of the crisis a little bit better because we can no longer rely on cheap credit and banks for the people. We can still rely on cheap credit for, you know, for corporations. That said, the next question about net neutrality, I mean, it's an important fight. Again, it has a certain American flavor to it, which is what I don't like. Because net neutrality, in a sense, is a compromise, that you're going to have private companies in charge of your telecommunications, which in America is the default assumption that nobody even is aware of, because they cannot question the fact that something will not be owned by private companies. And all you can do is just to regulate how they work. So yes, if you assume that all these companies will be private, then yes, we need some rules to discriminate them from, to prevent them from discriminating one set of traffic from another. But why should communications be in private hands? You know, sorry, I go beyond that. I don't think that that's an assumption that should not be opened. I mean, Switzerland of all places, having a referendum today, not just on basic income, but also on whether the national telecommunications firm should be brought into public ownership. I mean, Switzerland. I mean, net neutrality discourse cannot register such fine political economic issues because ultimately they already buy into the fact that you'll have big firms, you'll have TEAM, you'll have whatever, you know, Deutsche Telekom, you'll have O2 as big providers of infrastructure. They will be in private hands. They'll be heavily subsidized by governments and the European Commission. Of course, you'll never call it subsidies, so you'll call them whatever, innovation money, and that will be there in perpetuity. I don't buy that premise, even though I share the need to tie the hands of these firms as they exist, but I do not entirely abandon the political project of changing their status, which I think in net neutrality debate often gets lost. Was there something else? Yeah, so in open source, again, you have to understand that here, if you think about cities, so what are the traditional ways of pushing back in cities, right? You know what are the traditional ways. You try to remunicipalize parts of the infrastructure that have been privatized and brought under private control. So you're trying to renationalize the provision of water, the provision of electricity, the provision of gas, the provision of all the other utilities, which you think should be in public control, right? It works in some places, it doesn't work in others. You know, in this country you have a referendum about water and nothing happens afterwards. You know, in some countries it works. In Hamburg, they managed to bring in some of the utilities under public control. They tried to do it in Berlin. It works. The problem is that once you try to apply that toolkit to data and to technology, it's not obvious how to do it. You can do that kind of remunicipalization with the sensors that Cisco HP installs in your city. You cannot do that with Google, because Google operates very differently. They can be in your city and be key to the provision of many services without actually striking any deals with the city administration. So there is nothing to remunicipalize because they enter the city through their phones. And they enter the cities through many other devices, and they generate the kind of data that then allows them to become even more powerful without ever stepping in to the city, right? Which makes me think that, you know, you can, and there are a lot of people, you know, it's actually funny you mentioned open source, because the response that is also very much like the corporations to the smart city problem is the open source city, promoted by none other than Carlo Ratti, an Italian guy at MIT. Where, of course, all of the main political issues, control and ownership of data, whether data is a commodity and whether private property paradigm should spread to it, you know, whether we should actually keep these utilities in private hands or public hands, are completely eliminated. And the idea is that somehow by turning from closed source solutions to open source ones, which, you know, I generally embrace and support, we can resolve the issue. But this is not, you know, Android is an open source system. Like, what does it matter, right? I mean, again, we have to abandon this fetish of thinking that somehow open source systems do not lead to consolidation of power. I mean, they do, because there are other components to the system, some of which have to do with data, to which open source provides no solution whatsoever. Right? You can, of course, come up with all sorts of licensing regimes. You can come up with, you know, a new ownership paradigm for data. We need that new paradigm for data, but that's not what the current open source debate presupposes and would like to advance.
Sì, però è vero che prima quando parlavamo del...
True enough, when we were talking about cities, when we were talking about the fact that we are living our lives in the hands of corporations with proprietary software. If it were open source, then probably those data could also be managed by the local administrations.
This is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Yes, all of those platforms must be open source. The problem is that no city is capable of tackling a company like Google. I mean, New York can't do it, London can do it. You can only do it as a network. So if you have a network of cities that would like to tackle this problem in a modular fashion, and they say, you know, I will work on this part of the infrastructure, I will work on that part of infrastructure, and then we'll pull our data together, and we will try to actually find whether we can build or replicate part of this AI system. They can, but then you need politically aligned cities. You cannot take a neoliberal city like Amsterdam and hook it up with Barcelona and produce a common strategy to fight Google, because Amsterdam is not interested.
Chiarissimo, chiarissimo. Allora, avevo visto una mano alzata qui, prima questa persona qui in seconda fila. Tu eri, ecco, sì. E poi cerchiamo adesso di fare domande e risposte.
So, please ask quick questions and give quick answers. First question, very quickly. It is true that open source is a prerequisite, but it's not sufficient. And I would add that the whole chain must become open source. Google is not open source. Only a little part of the operating system that resides on our mobile phones is open source. But the whole chain must be open source to make data management really transparent. Okay, thank you very much.
Raccoglierei un po' di domande tutte insieme e poi lui risponde.
I will collect questions, but then he has to leave, as I said. So I would like to know from you whether there is social pressure to monitor individuals. In other words, are individuals led to monitor cities because of the pressure exerted on them, or to monitor, the good experience that they have, to share such good experiences with people who do not have the same experiences? So is this the impact of monitoring on individuals and cities, in your opinion?
So I have a question about developing countries. So usually developing countries have been able in history to learn from developed countries, but in this case you talked about a few companies gathering a lot of data and keeping it to themselves and obviously using it to earn a lot of money. So I was just wondering, how will this further develop in the future? So how will these developing countries be able to use this data, if at all, or this concentration of data in these few companies will just make the lag between developing countries and developed countries even bigger, or it will help developing countries, and how?
This is really a macro question. Fantastic presentation. So the capitalism is adjusting to this crisis temporarily by this extraction of the rest of our time and resources, but that doesn't, for each firm can then make billions of dollars off that, but that doesn't seem sustainable for the scale of it. Of course, we still have growing debt, no income, no growth. So just some more commentary on that. This doesn't seem that this is a scalable solution at the macro level.
Sure.
Cerco di chiederle una cosa ironica.
I'll try and ask you an ironic question. According to you,
per certi versi ha sostenuto che
data account for the food of our society. You said that IT corporations are reinventing the welfare state. Do you agree? We are in a university hall. I work in an occupational training center. And starting this year, we decided to move all our data to Google Cloud. So all our contents and everything have been moved to Google Cloud. So I would like to ask you what you think about this. Very final question.
Dunque, rete, dati e relazioni internazionali possono...
Network, data and international relations. Can the IT multinationals be subject to regulators' activity, be it Chinese or Indian regulators? What can we expect? Can we expect conflicts? I know this is not much to do with the core of your presentation, but could be an inevitable consequence of what you said.
Buongiorno, le pongo la domanda in italiano perché purtroppo in inglese sarebbe difficile. Ma in un mondo dei dati, dove forse lo Stato era l'entità che riusciva a raccogliere il più gran numero di dati e perciò è nato, serve ancora lo Stato o non serve? Possiamo parlare di una democrazia dei dati, a democracy of data, differente dalla democrazia che viviamo noi oggi, dove si condividono i dati per cercare di trovare le soluzioni, quando i dati invece non devono essere più elaborati dalla politica? La politica serve ancora? Lo Stato serve?
Questa è cretina.
You're an interesting guy, but you've become far too conspiratorial. The welfare state in Britain and elsewhere, it was obviously not designed simply to save capitalism. It was as a result of the demand of trade unions, working class above all, especially those who worked actually in nationalized industries like steel and coal at the same time. You tend to see things as a conspiracy to keep capitalism going, when actually, as you know, at least as well as I do, democracies are a site, as you said with your example on Switzerland, a site for a push and pull, a struggle between forces, between democratic and other forces. And above all, you haven't provided, perhaps you do elsewhere, any kind of convincing explanation of what happens afterwards, of what the mechanism is for example, nationalizing Google or nationalizing the data. How do you get from what you see as and I think in part rightly, a bad situation into something which is a good situation, and how does the good situation work?
I'll try to fit all of this into a 5-minute answer. Some of these questions, I think, were more important than others because they highlighted some of the gaps in what I've said. So maybe I'll focus on those first. So international dimension, I think it's very important to think through, not least because behind both the liberalization of the data flow regime and the promotion of the smart cities, there is clearly a geopolitical agenda with a lot of technology firms relying on governments to push through their trade, to push through their commercial interests. If you look, for example, at the website of the U.S. Department of Commerce and their section to Europe specifically, they will actually list 2 things that I think are key out of 3 for their priorities for their work in Europe. One of them is trade treaties like TTIP, which include provisions like free flow of data, which, you know, for the elites now corresponds to a kind of nice euphemism for free flow of capital, right, which aims at completely eroding whatever data protection regime has been enacted in Europe to precisely slow down and eliminate free flow of data. And second, the smart cities. You know, that actually says quite openly there that smart cities makes part of the U.S. commercial agenda in Europe, and not just of the U.S. one, right? So you have, if you look at a place like India, which brings us to developing countries, you know, Modi, their prime minister, has announced that first, he would like to build 100 smart cities in 5 years, which, of course, was a little bit too ambitious even for him. So then he scaled it out to 20. But after he scaled it down to 20, that nonetheless brought delegations from all over, U.S., China, even Russian companies went there, and especially Germany, with Siemens, Bosch, and a few others interested in pitching their own solutions. So you are now also seeing some interesting commercial conflicts that might be happening in this domain, but there is clearly a geopolitical component to it, which I think we need to understand much more thoroughly than I have tried to do. On the questions of alternatives, but also how sustainable that model is 2 questions, and also the conspiratorial nature of some of what I'm saying. I don't think it's actually conspiratorial. I mean, all of the proponents of the welfare state, I mean, you go and read their writings from Keynes to Beveridge, none of them actually like the term welfare state because they think it sounds too socialist, and they clearly would like to identify, I mean, clearly there are demands, and there are demands that have been in place because of the crisis and the Great Depression to build a different kind of capitalism. That does not mean that the people building it were not interested in a particular adjustment of how capitalism functions. And the reason why I said there was a way to fix capitalism is because it was clearly not a way to build communism, which is how a lot of the major mainstream commentary in, for example, the U.S. presents the welfare state. So in this sense, I don't think it's actually very conspiratorial what I'm saying. It seems quite mainstream. On the question of alternatives, I don't believe in nationalization of these firms because I don't think that you can actually have a robust national government now in Europe interested in pursuing it. It's not, and also I don't think that the right way to tackle Google is by building another company like Google, but with a European flag on top of it. I think it has to be done in a much more decentralized manner. It has to be done in a way where there is data that is pulled together by public institutions, cities, municipalities, universities, libraries, you name it, with all sorts of other players, including other cities, including other institutions, invited to build services and apps on top of it to resolve their own information needs. So if I'm a community of people who would like to offer our own bus service to go somewhere, yes, I would like to have access to the data about transportation needs of my citizens living in that neighborhood. But you need to have intermediary institutions aggregating that data so that additional services can be built on top of them, right? And I actually don't think that even Google believes that something like search will still be with us in the near future, because in the future information will find you and not the other way around, because there is so much data about you that is already well known that once you match it with a location, data will actually find you on demand. And this is how all of the new services like Google Now actually function. With regards to the sustainability of this model and this regime, I don't think it's actually sustainable, because all of the other elements of the system remain in place. The banks, the anger against the elites, it's my alarm telling me that I need to go, and the crisis is not solved. It's not solved in terms of the ecological dimension, and it's not solved in terms of the financial dimension, and it's not solved in terms of the anti-elitist dimension. And on top of that, now you have a new kind of right-wing parties emerging, which actually hate globalization, they hate global trade, and many of them, like the party in Poland, are interested in providing social benefits, or they're actually interested in completely defeating TTIP and all the treaties, not because they would like to protect the NHS or they would like to protect any of the benefits, because they would like to destroy them themselves on national terms and not on the international ones imposed by corporations. You have the left that's completely missing the boat on these issues, and it's a very, for me, a very problematic and turmoil-inducing situation. The additional resource, which I should have discussed in much more length, is the new forms of policing, which are also made possible with these technologies. I'm not just talking about drones, I'm also talking about the pervasion of facial recognition technologies and other ways to regulate those spaces and to basically to control for excessive outbursts of anger and protests, which are bound to hit the streets as the situation gets worse. And that will be an additional resource of coping. So yes, it might sound somewhat dark, but I sort of follow the news.
Is this the topic of a new book, or are you going to write on something else?
No. The book is finished. Should be out next year. So.
What's the title? Can we know?
It's no title yet. The Dark Ages, I think I should do.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Sure.
Let's keep in touch.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.